Momma's Ghost and the Reaper presented by Absolutely Haunted. Have you ever felt like something was watching you in the dead of night? That eerie sensation of unseen eyes lingering just beyond your vision? I think that hospitals, late at night, do that to you. They make you feel vulnerable, especially when you are watching someone you love slip away. It was nearly 2 a.m. The hospital room was steeped in silence, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and my mama's steady breathing. She lay asleep in the bed beside me, unaware of the unsettling weight pressing on my chest, or the sorrow growing in my heart. Days of being trapped in these sterile walls had left me restless and uneasy. Needing a moment to clear my mind, I quietly grabbed my purse and slipped out of the room, never expecting to step straight into the presence of death itself. The dimly lit hallway stretched before me, lined with doors that concealed whispered struggles and silent suffering. Behind each one, someone was battling their own nightmare, teetering on the edge of the unknown, my heart constricted for them. My empathy having increased since my mom was admitted a couple of weeks ago, and it became apparent that we would soon suffer a great loss. The air was thick with a sterile scent of antiseptic, yet beneath it lurked something else, something heavier. The machines hummed and beeped, their cold, mechanical sounds cutting through the stillness like eerie whispers in the dark. Each tone, each soft chime, was a reminder of life hanging in the balance, of fragile bodies held together by machines and willpower. Even the smallest malfunction could mean the difference between survival and something much more terrifying. I shuddered, pushing away the creeping dread that slithered through my thoughts. For the 100th time that day, I reminded myself how lucky I was to still have my mama. Yes, she has been touched by sickness, but she was still here with me. As I stood there in the dim glow of the flickering overhead light, I couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps luck had nothing to do with it at all, and that something was preparing to take from me the one person who I counted on, and there was nothing I could do about it, and that unseen something was just biding its time in the background while all this played out, just watching and waiting. In the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights, I found the hospital waiting room as it sat in eerie silence. The vending machines hummed softly, their neon glow casting unnatural shadows across the cold, sterile floor. At a small table near the vast glass window, I found my seat. I could feel the tension in my body. It had settled right into my shoulders, bringing about a certain measure of pain. I reached up and rubbed the back of my neck before my fingers curled around a paper cup that contained the water they called coffee. Through the rainy dark window, my eyes locked onto the figure I had not realized was standing on the other side of the pane of glass, a man so dark he almost looked like a shadow. He was staring in at me. He was hollow-cheeked and had a glow to his eyes that reminded me of a predator's eye in the dark. I realized why he appeared to blend into the blackness of the rainy night when I noticed everything he was wearing was black. His sunken eyes gleamed with something unnatural, something not quite human. The rain outside streaked the glass behind him, distorting the parking lot's empty, fog-drenched view. But there, just beyond the window, a shape lingered, a pale silhouette barely visible in the mist. I swallowed hard, gripping my cup as the man leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper. "You can see me, can't you?" The room suddenly felt colder. I jumped with the sound of his voice. How had I heard him with a thick glass between us? I knocked my purse off the table. Bending down, I picked it up, and when I righted myself, the man had disappeared. I leaned forward and squinted out the window through the rain, but he was no longer visible. As I turned my gaze back toward the bridge, my breath hitched. In the dim glow of the emergency lights, a frail old man shuffled across the walkway, his steps slow and deliberate. He moved away from me, his thin frame draped in a hospital gown, barely concealed beneath a worn terry robe. A rickety IV pole wobbled beside him, its wheels whispering against the floor in a rhythmic, unsettling cadence. For a fleeting moment, I wondered, did his nurses know he was out here, wandering the hospital corridors at this hour? But something about him felt off. The air around him seemed heavier, the shadows stretching unnaturally as he passed. And though I couldn't see his face, a strange chill curled around my spine, whispering that I wasn't just watching him. He was watching me too. As I was pondering if I should tell someone or not, the old man suddenly stopped and, turning quickly, looked directly at me. He even raised his frail hand and waved at me. I was shocked to realize that every hair on my body suddenly raised. Again, how did he know I was observing him? For that matter, why did I feel so frightened by some poor old gentleman who, most likely by the looks of him, did not have much longer to live? I found that I suddenly very much wanted to escape to my mother's room, and as I picked up my purse to return there, I saw the old gentleman continue on through the doors, to the other side of the hospital. I was thinking how unkind it was that I hoped I never saw him again. That was just a little too creepy. I turned and made my way to the waiting room doorway, but to my shock found my way was now impeded by the same little man who I had just witnessed go into the other wing. How in the world did you get here so fast? I thought. He looked to be the same man, but that was impossible. I started to think that what I needed to do was to go back to the safety of my mother's room. Safety? I really was just too tired. I chuckled to myself, but there was still no denying that the hair on my body was standing at attention once again. The old man suddenly spoke up. "Oh no. You're not going already?" he asked. "I wanted to talk to you, just a little bit. Could I have a few moments? You see, you have my attention. Not too many people notice me like you did. Most let me pass by without notice. I think it makes them feel safer that they don't acknowledge me. You see?" He finished his sentence with a shrug of his bony shoulders. "See what?" I replied stupidly. "You're not trying to tell me you are the same man who was just on the bridge to the other side of the hospital, are you? How could anyone do that? Travel so far so quick?" I gave a nervous giggle. Something about this man gave me the creeps, but I could not place anything any different about him than any other older person. He smiled a knowing smile at me and made a request. "Can we sit?" He waved his hand towards the same seat I had just vacated moments before. I was feeling so freaked out, but questioning why. I mean, what could any old man so frail possibly do to anyone to hurt them? Feeling uneasy, I took the same seat as before, and the old gentleman settled into the seat faster than I would have imagined he could do, given his age and appearance. He began. I must say, he was looking at me with surprise on his face. "When I felt you staring so openly at me, well, I was shocked. Most do not do that, you must know." He smiled at me. "Yes. You must be something quite special, Valerie." He grinned back at me, showing all his missing teeth. "Special? Now that is not something I would ever say or think about myself. I don't know about special," I replied. "I think I just might be quite ordinary." He turned his rheumy eyes to me and squinted. "I think you know better than that." Wait. How did he know my name? Warning bells were going off in my mind and I was getting ready to take flight. I could feel it. I was that scared. But why? The way he spoke as if he knew me made me feel uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," I said. "I really need to get back to my mother," as I started to rise from my seat. "Okay, I understand, it is not your time after all. It's just so few acknowledge me, even when they are right next to me, but you hurry along now. I will see you again soon enough." That was never going to happen. If I ever saw him first, I would go the other way. I was thinking as I rushed away down the endless corridors. I did not know what about that old man put me off, but I can clearly say I hope I never encounter him again. I soon realized in my haste to get away I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now I was hopelessly lost. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones as I hurried down the dimly lit hallway searching for my mother's room. My pulse pounded in my ears, an unshakable sense of unease clawing at my mind. I turned a corner, but hesitation struck. Had I taken this path before? The layout of the hospital had been clear in my head, yet this corridor felt unfamiliar. The overhead lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls. Then, sound. A slow, rhythmic creaking echoed from just ahead, beyond the next bend. My breath hitched, and without thinking, my pace faltered. Every instinct screamed at me, "Don't go any further. Don't look." But my body disobeyed, frozen in place, torn between retreat and the gnawing need to know. The creaking grew louder. Steady. Closer. Something was coming. And it was just about to turn the corner. Relief washed over me, just for a second, when I saw the wheelchair turn the corner. But that feeling evaporated the moment I took a closer look. A woman sat slumped in the chair, her long, tangled red hair cascading over her face like a curtain. She didn't move, didn't react. Something about her posture was wrong, her head hung low, her shoulders unnaturally rigid. Then, my gaze dropped to her arms. They were pale, almost sickly white, marred by thick, rope-like veins that twisted up her skin, vanishing beneath the short sleeves of her tattered hospital gown. Then I noticed the straps, tight restraints binding her to the chair. My stomach turned. I suddenly realized the most horrifying detail of all. She was coming toward me. The wheelchair rolled forward, slow and deliberate. But her hands never touched the wheels. I felt my breath catch in my throat, as ice-cold dread crawled down my spine. If she wasn't moving the chair, then who was? I pressed myself against the wall, my body screaming for distance, for escape. But there was nowhere to go. The wheelchair rolled closer, gliding soundlessly over the floor until it was right beside me. A thick rope of drool hung from beneath the tangled mass of red hair, stretching long and slow, dripping into a growing, wet pool in her lap. The smell hit me next: rot, decay, something old and festering. My stomach lurched, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run. The chair stopped. A heartbeat of silence. And then, hands shot forward. Somehow they were no longer restrained. Cold, bony fingers clamped around my arms, an iron grip locking me in place. My breath hitched, terror clawing up my throat as my mind caught up to what was happening. The woman's head remained bowed, her hair still veiling her face. But then, she giggled. The sound wasn't human. It was low. Deep. Wrong. Not the voice of a woman. But of a man. A sick, guttural laugh that vibrated through the air, slithering into my bones like a death rattle. And I was trapped. An angry shout. "What do you think you're doing?" The words slithered through the air like a hiss, cold and sharp. A voice that didn't belong. I gasped, my body jerking involuntarily as I twisted to look behind me, still trapped in the iron grip of the thing in the wheelchair. My arms burned under the pressure of her inhuman strength, her fingers like vices clamped around my skin. And then I saw him. The old man stood a few feet away, frail in his hospital robe and worn slippers, the IV pole dragging behind him like a rusted chain. But there was something in his stance, something that made my blood run colder than it already was. "Drop it." His voice lashed through the air, harsh and commanding, directed at the girl, no, the thing, restraining me. The thing in the chair whined. A sickly, guttural sound, almost animalistic, like a scolded dog caught in the act of something wrong. I said now. The command was absolute, and then, her fingers unclenched. I didn't hesitate. The second my arms were free, I ran. I barely registered the old man muttering something to the thing in the chair behind me. I didn't care. I just ran, blind with terror, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The corridor twisted and stretched around me, the flickering lights casting warped, ghostly shadows along the walls. I didn't stop. Not until I reached my mother's room. Panting, I braced myself against the wall, my whole body trembling. I forced in a breath, then another, trying to steady the violent shudder in my chest. I had no idea what had just happened. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was afraid. After everything that had just happened, after that thing in the wheelchair, after the old man's chilling command, I barely knew how to breathe, let alone think. My hands still shook as I shoved open my mother's hospital room door, my pulse a frantic, stuttering thing inside my chest. And then I froze. My mother wasn't in her bed. She was sitting upright on the small sofa near the door, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't been lying motionless for days. My breath hitched. "Mom?" My voice cracked. "What is going on?" She looked up at me, bright-eyed, alert, smiling. "Oh, Valerie." She beamed, her voice warm, familiar, her old voice, before the illness had stolen it away. "I was hoping you'd get back before I have to go." A cold wave of confusion crashed over me, thick and suffocating. "Have to go?" My words came out uneven, my brain scrambling for logic, for reason. This isn't right. This doesn't make sense. I glanced toward the hospital bed, the crumpled sheets untouched, as if she had never been in them. But she had been. She was practically comatose less than an hour ago. My gaze snapped back to her. She shouldn't be awake. She shouldn't be smiling. She shouldn't be out of that bed. My fingers tightened around the doorframe as a deep, crawling dread coiled in my stomach. What was happening? I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Mom, how are you out of bed? Are you feeling better?" I asked with uncertainty. "Oh yes, I feel like a kid again, I really can't explain it." My mother said it gently, her voice calm, too calm. "Why are you here?" She asked with a smile. Well, Mom, your doctors told Dad and I that you were not going to make it much longer, and. Oh, how sweet. She chimed, you didn't want me to pass alone. A slow, icy trickle of dread slipped down my spine. I just stared at her, at the soft look in her eyes, at the way she gazed at me with a quiet compassion, like she was the one comforting me. Valerie, she said, tilting her head slightly. I have to leave soon, and I need you to tell your father that I love him. And that I will miss him always. My whole body locked up. A deep, twisting sense of wrongness slithered through me. Mom? My voice barely rose above a whisper. What are you saying? She was speaking as if she were already gone. As if this, her being awake, her speaking, was nothing more than a temporary flicker of something unnatural, something that shouldn't be happening. Panic surged in my chest. I think I'd better call a nurse. I pushed up from my chair, my movements sharp, sudden. I needed someone else to be here, to see this, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The door swung open. Hard. Too hard. I jerked around, heart hammering. The old man from the waiting room stood in the doorway. The same frail figure in his robe and slippers. The same sagging IV bag still dripping, the metal pole dragging behind him with a faint scrape. But this time, he wasn't just watching. He had stepped inside. And for the first time, I noticed his eyes. Dark. Too dark. And locked directly on me. My mother's face lit up with a beaming smile as she turned toward the old man. Oh, you're back. Can we leave now? The old man stepped forward, his frail fingers reaching out to squeeze my mother's hand. His skin was paper-thin, mottled with deep purple veins. Soon, he murmured, his voice a low rasp that slithered through the room like a dying breath. A sick feeling coiled in my gut. My pulse pounded in my ears. Excuse me? My voice trembled, but I pushed forward. Mom, you are not going anywhere with this man. I could feel the panic rising, the air in the room thickening like molasses. Something was horribly wrong. The old man turned to me slowly, deliberately. His gaze was hollow, bottomless. Then, without a word, he raised his hand toward me. The moment his fingers lifted, a crushing pressure wrapped around my mouth, an invisible, suffocating force like steel bands clamping my jaw shut. My breath hitched. I clawed at my face, trying to break free, but there was nothing there. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. I could only watch in horror as my mother smiled at the man like an old friend, utterly unaware of the nightmare unfolding right in front of her. He moved with an eerie calm, turning slightly as he lifted a frail, withered hand and gestured toward my mother's hospital bed across the room. Something compelled my gaze to follow. And then, I saw it. My breath hitched in my throat. There, lying motionless in the bed, was my mother. How had the bed been empty before? Her body was still, her face serene, her chest rising and falling in the same shallow rhythm it had for weeks. The machines beeped and whirred, their cold, mechanical sounds filling the air exactly as they always had. I felt my stomach drop, a sickening wave of dread washing over me. My mother was sitting beside me, speaking, smiling, yet she was also lying in that bed. This wasn't possible. My mind refused to understand what my eyes were showing me. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. My mother was no longer seated on the couch. She was standing beside the old man. But something was wrong, something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The color had drained from her skin, leaving her an unnatural, ghostly pale. And then I saw it, the truth that made my stomach twist into a knot of pure terror. She wasn't solid. Her form wavered, flickering like a dying candle flame. The dim light of the hospital room bled through her, her edges blurred like mist. I felt my knees buckle. A sick dizziness swelled inside me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I tried to scream, to force out any sound, but nothing came. My throat was locked in a silent, suffocating vice. The old man's withered hand lifted, settling gently on my mother's shoulder. His fingers barely seemed to touch her, as if she too was nothing more than air. She giggled. But the sound was distant, hollow, laced with something that didn't belong. I wanted to run. I wanted to wake up. But I was trapped in the nightmare, and there was nowhere to go. Are we going to see Mama and Daddy now? My mother asked, her voice light, eager, childlike. A bright, unnatural excitement lit up her face. I wanted to answer, to tell her something, anything, but my tongue felt thick, useless. My pulse pounded in my ears like a war drum. Yes, the old man said, his voice smooth, almost kind. Then he changed. Right before my eyes, the frail, withered man with his sunken features and hollow eyes was gone. In his place stood something else. Something ancient. Something inevitable. A black void stretched where his face should have been, shrouded beneath the tattered hood of a flowing, endless cloak. His frail hands had become skeletal, gnarled fingers curling around the long, gleaming scythe he now carried with effortless grace. The Grim Reaper. The air in the room thickened, pressing against me like unseen hands. My mother, my not mother, beamed at him with innocent joy, completely unafraid. I, however, could barely breathe. This was a nightmare. It had to be. But deep down, I knew, this was real. Terror exploded within me, a suffocating force that sent my pulse into a frantic, painful rhythm. My entire body screamed for me to run, to escape the impossible sight before me, but I could do nothing except stumble backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure, no, the thing, tilted its hooded head ever so slightly, as if amused by my horror. Then, from within the abyss of its shadowed face, a sound emerged, a deep, guttural chuckle that slithered through the air like a whisper of death itself. A voice, rich and hollow, reverberated through the room. "Not your time." The words slithered down my spine like icy fingers, wrapping around my lungs, squeezing. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed, trapping my terror inside. Then my mother, my not mother, spoke, her voice carrying a warmth that did not belong in this nightmare. "It's all right, Valerie. It's not your turn." The figure of death loomed closer, the very air around it heavy with finality. "I will see you again. Soon." The promise dripped from its words like poison, and I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that this was no empty threat. And just like that, they were gone. One moment, the Reaper and my mother stood before me, and the next, they faded into nothingness, like smoke dissolving into the air. But the laughter remained. That chilling, inhuman laughter echoed through the room, crawling into my ears, slithering down my spine. It lingered long after they had vanished, an invisible presence curling in the corners of the dim hospital room. Even as silence crept back in, I could still hear it, like a whisper embedded deep inside my mind. The room exploded into chaos as shrill alarms and flashing lights signaled a code red from my mother's hospital bed. Nurses and doctors rushed in, their frantic voices blending into a panicked blur. I sat frozen on the worn sofa, my body numb, my mind disconnected from the frenzy around me. They worked desperately, shouting orders, pressing defibrillator paddles to her chest, but I already knew, it was futile. The Reaper had already taken her. I watched in a daze, my breath shallow, the room tilting slightly as my mind struggled to grasp reality. It all seemed unreal, like a fever dream unraveling before me. The night's events replayed in my head, each moment more absurd than the last. If I told anyone what I had witnessed, they would call me insane. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. I could not process this night. I had spoken to my mother's ghost. Not a dream, not a hallucination, her spirit, standing before me, speaking as if death had never touched her. I had been seized by something in the wheelchair that was unnatural, something that reeked of malice, a demon, or something worse. Its touch still burned in my memory, an iron grip that felt like it had reached past my flesh and clutched my very soul. And then, there was him. The Reaper. Not a myth, not a shadowy legend, but a presence so real, so undeniable, that I had stood face to face with death itself. He had spoken to me, not in riddles or cryptic warnings, but with chilling certainty. "Not your time. But soon." Now, every tick of the clock, every breath I take, carries the weight of that word, soon. I live in quiet dread, never knowing when the Reaper will return. For me,